Good morning, everyone. We're here in this fine morning overlooking our beautiful Banta Bowl field. And my name is Fernando. This is
Taylor.
Rishi.
and
Kelly.
and we are the High Psychos, and we are studying hallucinogens. So today we're going to talk about a study done by Lynette Ramos, Callum Hicks, Alex Carminer, Caillou Kudo, Rajeshwar Nalawar, Michael Kasu, and Ion S. McGregor. The study was received in 2013 and was officially published in 2016. The topic of the study was seeing how MDMA, also known as ecstasy or Molly, oxytocin, and vasopressin modulate social preference in rats, and what role handling and oxytocin receptors play in this preference. So to start off, we're going to have Taylor explain why this study was done and why we should even be paying attention to it.
All right, so from what I read, the reason that this research could have been done, because there could be a different reason than what I saw, but the reason I think this research was done was to observe like a closer role, or like what role does certain receptors play in the effect of pro-social party drugs, and specifically what in the brain causes the pro-social effects to take place. There could also be the reason that wanted to see the different effects between the receptors, the specific receptors in the brain that can also produce these effects, and see what happens if you use a more version, oh dear gosh, I cannot speak. If you use more of that specific neuropeptide in the brain and compare that to what the drug does. The reason that we should be paying attention to this is because we want to know what drugs do. It'd be very interesting to, see what they do and see exactly like what they do in the brain, and just to see how everything plays out.
Okay. Next, we'll have Kelly talk about her research methods.
So first, the male rats were purchased and then divided into 4 large plastic tubes that were kept around 21 degrees Celsius. The tubes alternated from 12 hours of light to 12 hours of darkness. The different divisions of rats corresponded with the different handling conditions that were used. It ranged from well-handed, which included being handled daily for 5 minutes, to minimally handled rats, where they were only held for 1 minute, the day before they were tested. It's important to note that both a male and a female were present during the handling and testing, in order to reduce the effects a rodent's behavior has on a male scent. Next, they purchased the MDMA, OT, and AVP, which they dissolved into a saline. The V1AR antagonist got dissolved as well, and the OTR was synthesized, all then ready to be administered. Following the drug preparations came the actual experiment, where they performed the social preference test. The testing took place in a rectangular arena that was dimly lit with a red light. After 30 seconds of being in the arena, the rat got introduced to the empty cage, where it had a chance to explore it for 4 minutes before the cage with the inhabitant was present for an equal amount of time, another 4 minutes. There were cameras that were used to detect the amount of time the rat engaged in an active investigative state. Before each test, the rat was injected with a respective drug treatment, 20 minutes prior to testing, except for in experiment 7, where the rats were injected 2 times instead of just once in the beginning. They conducted 7 experiments overall. The main measurement was finding or proving a correlation between the handling condition of the rats, high versus minimal, to the dosage amount of MDMA, OT, and AVP, high versus low amounts, and how those factors affected the rat's social preference. On a different note, though, experiment 6 and 7 showed emphasis on the effects of C25 and the V1AR antagonist, how they impact social preference in general, and how they inhibit OT and AVP when they got administered.
Okay, next is Rishi, who will explain what the results mean, what conclusions we can draw from them, and what they say about the effects of MDMA on rats.
Sure. So, the first experiment that was run, they tested the effects of MDMA, oxytocin, and vasopressin on the social preference of well-handled rats. So this is like the main experiment they were looking at. So they did some two-way ANOVA analysis, and they found that the MDMA, in the vasopressin experiment, so they ran like 3 different experiments in this one where they gave MDMA to rats, they gave oxytocin, and they gave vasopressin, and they also gave the vehicle, which was just saline, I believe. So only in the vasopressin experiment was there an overall main effect for treatment, and they conducted post hoc comparisons, and they found that rats that were treated with all 3, MDMA, oxytocin, and vasopressin, showed a significant preference for the inhabited cage over the empty cage, while the rats treated with just the vehicle had no such preference. So this shows a social preference, which is, what their hypothesis was. So for experiment 2, they were looking at the effects of a lower dose of MDMA, oxytocin, and vasopressin on the same social preference in well-handled rats, different rats though, and they found no significant main effects of stimulus treatment or stimulus by treatment interaction, which makes sense because they're using a lower dose and they're not reaching the threshold that should make the rats more socially active. Experiment 3, they looked at the effects of MDMA, oxytocin, vasopressin on social preference in the minimally handled rats. And so they found significant effects of stimulus treatment and stimulus by treatment interaction effect. They found that the minimally handled rats that were either given the vehicle, which was saline, or MDMA spent significantly more time investigating the inhabited cage than the empty cage, which shows a social preference. And rats treated with vasopressin tended to prefer the inhabited cage, and those treated with oxytocin spent around the same time investigating both cages, both inhabited and empty. Experiment 4 was the effects of, again, a lower dose of MDMA, oxytocin, and vasopressin on minimally handled rats. They found significant effects of stimulus, but no significant main effect of treatment or an interaction effect. And their post hoc comparison showed that all rats investigated the inhabited cage more than the empty cage, demonstrating a social preference, which is interesting because from the earlier experiment, where they tested lower doses, they didn't find any main effects. So that's kind of interesting. Experiment 5 was a direct comparison of the social preference of the well-handled rats and the minimally handled rats. And so there was an overall effect of stimulus and a stimulus by handling interaction, but there was no main effect of handling itself. The minimally handled rats spent significantly more time investigating the inhabited cage than the empty cage, which is also interesting, which demonstrates the social preference. And there was no significant difference between the groups of rats in terms of the time investigating either cage, both either the empty or the inhabited cage. Experiment 6 was the effects of C25 and SR49059, which I believe were 2 different drugs, I think. Yeah. Yep. And so they found no significant effects of stimulus or treatment and no interaction effects in the well-handled rats. However, in the minimally handled rats, there was a significant main effect of stimulus and of treatment, but no interaction effect. In the minimally handled rats, C25 significantly reduced the time spent investigating the inhabited cage, but not the empty cage. And minimally handled rats, given either a vehicle or C25, spent longer investigating the inhabited cage than the empty cage, which demonstrates some social preference. And C25 reduced overall investigation times relative to the investigation times of the rats that were given the vehicle. In well-handled rats, there was no overall effect of stimulus treatment or stimulus by treatment interaction. But in minimally handled rats, in minimally handled rats treated with the SR49059 drug, they showed a significant overall main effect of stimulus and treatment, but no interaction effect. So they ran some post hoc comparisons on their effects that were significant, and they found that the SR drug did not alter social preference in the minimally handled rats, as both that drug and the vehicle treated rats, or rats that were treated with both that drug and the vehicle investigated the inhabited cage significantly more than the empty cage. However, the SR drug did reduce overall investigation time in minimally handled rats, which appeared due to the reduced interest in the empty cage, but not in the inhabited cage. And finally, the seventh and final experiment, they tested the effects of C25 and SR49059 on MDMA, oxytocin, and vasopressin-induced social preference. With C25, there was an overall effect of treatment and stimulus by treatment interaction, but no effect of just stimulus. Their post hoc tests showed that the vehicle rats and those who were pre-treated with C25 before oxytocin or vasopressin, so they were given the C25 drug, and then they were given oxytocin or vasopressin. They spent an equivalent amount of time investigating the empty and inhabited cages, which shows no social preference. Rats were pre-treated with C25 and then given MDMA. Still did show a social preference, though. It was found that C25 pre-treatment significantly reduced the overall investigation time, which was an effect that appeared primarily due to rats treated with both C25 and MDMA showing greatly reduced interest in the empty cage, but not in the inhabited cage. With the SR drug, there was an overall effect of stimulus and a stimulus by treatment interaction effect, but no effect on treatment. Their post hoc test showed that rats pre-treated with the SR drug before MDMA, oxytocin, or vasopressin spent significantly more time investigating the social stimulus compared to the object stimulus, which was unlike the rats treated with the vehicle, which spent an equivalent amount of time investigating both. The SR pre-treatment had no effect on overall investigation times, although it was found that the rats given the SR plus MDMA spent significantly less time investigating the empty cage than the control rats. So that was it.
Okay, thank you. Finally, I will go more in depth about the discussion and how the study relates to us as humans. So in the discussion, we basically address our reasoning for this experiment again, which we explained in the beginning, but basically is it examined the prosocial effects of MDMA, OT, and AVP in long-Evan rats using the social preference test. As we explained in the beginning, the primary aim was to determine whether these drugs, which by previous research appear to stimulate V1AR receptor indirectly or directly stimulate sociability, show comparable prosocial effects within the behavioral paradigm. The discussion then goes on to talk about the results and similar studies examined. And so overall, in the results, they found that the social preference produced by each treatment relies mostly on the decreased exploration of the empty cage rather than the increased exploration of the inhabited cage. So in other words, the rats explored a social stimuli more than a non-social stimuli. So we find similar results in a study done by Madular in 2014 in male prairie voles, which shows that OT reduces preference for non-social objects. In another study done by Hollander in 2003, we see that intravenous infusion of OT in human individuals with autism significantly reduce repetitive behavior compared to a placebo. So clearly in this, we can see that OT has an effect on the reduction of non-social objects. But how exactly does this relate to MDMA? So according to a study done in 2014 by Wardle, MDMA administration increased positive responses to social stimuli and decreases responses to non-social stimuli in a reactivity to emotion task where individuals were presented with positive, negative, and neutral pictures containing a social or non-social component. Moving forward, it addresses critical results found within the study, such as rats receiving minimal handling, showing a clear social preference and at baseline. So we can see this in the results of experiment 5 as well. It mentions the studies that show MDMA increased generalized anxiety, but decreases social anxiety, as reported by most humans. So going back to OT, it has recently been considered as an antidepressant and an anxiolytic in rodents when received intracranially, which was reported by Newman and Landgraf in 2012. So in humans, OT may increase anxiety in situations involving a threat or uncertainty. In many rodent species, we see this when they huddle or flock together under threatening situations, which can lead us to the assumption that overall anxiety is increased, and the results could just be a mere reflection of this anxiety. So, to counter this, according to McGregor, this defense mechanism is sensitive to the V1AR antagonism, which would lead us to believe that SR4905 would prevent social preference. So, looking at this study, however, this is not the case. And that's it for the discussion. So next, I think we want to go into the opinions and the limitations that we each saw in the study. So let's see who's going to rip apart Lynette's research first. Okay, who wants to go first?
I'll go first. This is really nitpicky, so I'm sorry. But I feel like next time, so in a future experiment, I would mention the number of rats purchased, so sample size, because it's important to make sure that the sample size is big enough in order for the results to be reliable. For example, anyone may be able to fix their results and make it appear to look one way when it's really just due to the sample size being too small. Therefore, unreliable and invalid data. I just feel like it's important for the readers to know that, so they don't question your reliability or validity of your results, because without that, the results you gathered become useless.
Yeah. Another thing is, I would have liked to know more on what this does to humans itself. That would have been nice, because, like, it seems that the MDMA increased social preference in these rats, and based off of what I've heard people tell me and read about MDMA, it increases social preference in humans as well. But I don't know. I guess I kind of would like to know more about what this study has affect, like how it affects humans more. Another thing was the prior handling of the rats, like how were they kept and handled, and like before they were purchased, like also like where were they purchased from? Were they purchased from like a PetSmart or like a rat farm? I don't know. But so those were just a couple of things I had.
Okay. You want to go next?
Oh yeah, sure. Especially because I kind of want to go off of Rishi's point with like the effects on humans, like the effects on MDMA on humans, which I forgot to mention that probably the reason that this experiment was done was because we can't do it on humans, because you can't neglect a human being and then feed them chemicals or drugs in
That's
order to
true.
figure out how
that is
to
true.
work. So that could definitely be a limitation. I agree.
Okay, well, yeah. So I would say a limitation, I guess, is like how the handling would relate to humans, and like what exactly does that factor correlate into humans? Like we talked about it, and it said something about tickling, but like in humans, I don't think that would necessarily make someone more social. So yeah, and then I also think that because each experiment factors in a new variable, it's kind of hard to distinguish or make observations as within subjects rather than between subjects. But overall, I think the experiment was well done, and they definitely accounted for many variables. And obviously, we do have some sort of evidence that MDMA causes more sociability within these animals.
Can I piggyback off of what Rishi was saying about the handling real quick? So that is definitely a limitation that I saw as well, the prior process handling of rodents before the researchers obtained them. I also thought, would it make a difference if the inhabited cage went first versus the second? For example, the longer one spends in an unknown area, the more familiar or comfortable they will become. So is it in fact just the medication or also the exposure time part of the cause as to why some rats explored more when they had more time, especially considering that they had 4.5 minutes of exposure time already to their new environment? So couldn't you argue that that exposure itself contributes to more exploration with time? Therefore, the limitation being only one mode of exposure, the empty cage then inhabited cage, versus also exploring the results by switching the order and seeing if that in and of itself is a confounding variable that we need to get rid of and control next time.
So going off of Kelly said, I believe each injection lasted about 20 minutes, right?
It wasn't injected 20 minutes before.
Or 20 minutes before, but like
Yeah.
I said, 20 minutes before.
Yeah.
So yeah, like what Kelly was saying, like how that would affect the sociability of the animal already previous to the exposure of the new cages. So obviously that'd be kind of hard to control because you do have to implement the treatment first. So in a way, I'm not necessarily sure how we could actually control for that variable, but yeah, that's a limitation that might be affecting the experiment as well. Does anybody else have anything else?
Not limitations, but like, I really liked the article. I thought it was pretty well done. I'm not just sucking up to Dr. Ramos, but I don't know. I thought they accounted for a lot, and they were very, very thorough in the type of experiments they ran. They ran 7 fucking experiments, which seems like a lot. Seems like it would take a lot of time. So I don't know. I thought it was well written. I liked what they did. I liked the subject that they were looking into with social preference and how MDMA affects it. I thought it was well done.
I think I'd also like to see how AVP, clearly in the first experiment, it had a big kind of result where it was one of the only ones that resulted in, I believe, a decrease in investigation of the empty cage. So I kind of want to see how AVP, rather than necessarily MDMA and OT, affect the animal as well. So maybe just doing a separate experiment of just AVP versus the other ones. So, yeah. Yeah, and then maybe even doing a different species of rats, and also the rats were all male, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
So maybe gender could also affect it as well.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Maybe,
or even mention if there is a difference between the genders.
Yeah.
And explain that in your article why you chose specifically just to do male.
Yeah. Okay. So I think up next we just want to share a few stories.
Oh, can I give some opinions?
Oh, of course.
Sorry.
Yeah.
This was kind of already said already, I guess, but I just think that you could have made it more clear about the bigger picture of the research, like how it connects to humans. And some questions that I had, I guess, are why would we want to increase social preference? What are the benefits / big picture of that? And then a couple things that I really liked about the experiment is I liked how both the female and male experimenters had to be present for both the testing and handling in order to not contaminate the rat's behavior/results. But I wish we were given more detail on why that is important. How much effect does the male scent have on a rodent's behavior? In the article, the broad words of possible effects were used, but what effects does it have on the rodent's behavior? That's still unknown, at least to me. I also liked how the time the rat investigated each cage was not timed manually, because besides adding room for error, the researcher themselves could have been biased, so tampered with the results in order to prove their hypothesis. So this way, having it done by electronics, it ensures validity. So I like that.
All right, so I think, is everybody good?
I'm good.
Okay. So I think next up, we just want to share two personal stories that of someone on MDMA, and I guess just kind of go off and determine how their stories relate to the experiment done. And since we can't really have human trials, I guess. So
Well,
I mean,
not here right now.
Yeah.
Maybe your personal time, but yeah.
yeah. Okay, so the story goes, my first and only time doing ecstasy was when I went to a rave, Zed, with my friends. I didn't really know what to expect as I had never taken this drug before, but from what I've heard from others, it's supposed to make you very happy. When I arrived at the rave, it was still about 30 minutes before Zed, and that's when I took a quarter of the ecstasy pill. Once Zed arrived, I took another quarter because I did not feel the effect of the drug. In total, I took half an ecstasy pill. For about 30 minutes during Zed, I was feeling a little unhappy because I wasn't feeling the effects of the drugs. After 30 minutes, though, was when I probably started feeling the effects of the drug. When it hit, I forced myself to switch my mindset from sad to happy, telling myself that being sad sucks, so might as well be happy. I then became happy, and the lights at the rave became visually enhanced, and I could feel the rhythm of the music in my body. For the duration of the rave, I was extremely happy. If I were to really describe ecstasy, I would say it's a drug that makes you happy and makes you think of only positive things. All the worries in your life and things that make you sad virtually disappear. When ecstasy begins to take effect, all you feel is happy and you just want to be around other people and socialize. The next story goes, the first and only time I tried ecstasy, in this case Molly, I had a mostly positive experience. A couple months ago, when I was 22 years old at the time, I decided to take Molly while out partying with my friends. I was told beforehand to not mix alcohol with the pill, so I decided not to. At first, I didn't feel anything, but all of a sudden, I felt a rush of energy take over my body. I couldn't stand still, I needed to keep moving. I kept thinking to myself that I need to sit down and drink water, but the rush of energy was just too powerful. The party was packed, and at one point I felt too overwhelmed with everyone there. It was getting hot, and I kept moving around, trying to just breathe. I went all around talking to people I had never met before. This was strange to me. I'm usually really quiet and don't approach strangers. I tried to avoid small talk at all costs, but I was having random conversations with strangers like it was nothing. I was very loud and extremely social. I don't remember how much time had passed, but I felt as if time had slowed down for a while. The rush went away, and all of a sudden I felt myself calming down. I felt so thirsty that no matter how much water I drank, I was still dying of thirst. I finally found a place to sit, and I just remember everything being blurry. I sat there not being able to control what was coming out of my mouth or stand up. My friends kept giving me water to drink, but I felt as if I was not able to drink it. At this point, I just needed to close my eyes because my head was spinning. After what felt like hours, I finally got up and made it home. I don't remember the ride home. I just remember the blurry lights of the streets as we drove home. The next day, I experienced a hangover like no other. Probably not a hangover. I don't think it was a hangover. But I woke up with the worst headache and was nauseous the whole day. I could barely get out of bed and spent most of the day in bed still dizzy. I couldn't hold anything down, so I mostly tried to stay hydrated with water, but that didn't work too well. The next couple of days, I felt as if I had no energy and needed at least 2 days after taking it to finally get back to normal. it was an overall positive experience except for the come down. That was not fun at all. Okay, so judging from these two stories, clearly it's like two kind of different stories where one person he only needed half of a pill to get himself
Get the
going.
effects,
Get the
yeah.
effects. And clearly with this story, the second story, she felt like the next day drained of energy. And I would imagine it also drains your emotions.
Yeah.
Like very, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so I also have a friend who has taken Molly. So one of my pretty close friends, he in high school he was like, oh, I'll try things like once, like he was not that person, right? So he did like acid. Actually, he did that twice, but like, and so like all throughout high school he was like, oh, I really want to try like MDMA, I really want to try Molly, and then so now he goes to school in St. Andrews in Scotland. And so over there, it's pretty easy to get Molly. At least it's easier there than in like New Hampshire, where I'm from. And so he was there, and he was at a party, and then so he finally did it. Like his fucking like high school goal. He was like he took Molly. He didn't take too much, but like he told me like. He kept messaging me while he was on. He was like, "Bro, I feel like I'm about to die." Like, I think like just the energy that he experienced was so much. And I don't think he took that high of a dose. Or at least he didn't think so. But he now he does not like Molly as much as he did in high school. But yeah, he was like, yeah, it was just so much. And then the next day and like the next like week, I just like all my emotions were gone. Like I couldn't really feel happy because like that's what Molly does, right? It kind of increases your dopamine and just kind of drains you of it. But like that was his experience, and that's what he's told me. It's like he now very much does not like it as much as he once did after experiencing it only once.
Okay. Well, I think from these three stories, we can kind of see how the experiment would relate to these.
Yeah.
Kind of seeing like how Molly increases your your sociability,
Yeah.
and just in general, just like the after effects, just like the drainage of your body and your emotions. So, yeah.
And also, it was brought up at one point that there was like 20 minutes in between the injection of the rats and then the actual like taking place of the experiment. And then in the first story, there was for about like 30 minutes, they didn't really like feel the effects yet. And I think that might have been the reason why, because you need time for it to like kick in, and then it's like, oh shit.
Yeah.
Or else then, yeah, because like you have one first, like there's the empty cage where the effects didn't take place.
Yep.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
So that would make sense.
Okay. Well, thank you everybody for listening to our podcast. Hope you enjoyed. And again, we are the High Psychos. And thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
What?
Bye.